It is our pleasure on this month's edition of Book Club to be joined by the author of A Decided Novelty, The Essential Guide to Black Pro Wrestling History, covering the years from 1880 up into 1950. It's a pleasure for Neil and I to welcome author Ian Douglas. And Ian, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us. Me and Neil, we both thought reviewing this book would be great, but to have you on itself, we thought that would be the best way to kind of go through this because this really is, you see the word essential in a lot of books. This one really lives up to it. Like, this is, I would call a must read for a lot of people that, quite frankly, cover a lot of figures that I would think even your ardent wrestling followers would be learning about for the first time. So I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but there's a lot to take away from this book. So thank you very much for sitting down with us.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to get the invite, and I hope I can live up to your lofty expectations. When it comes to your use of the word essential, honestly, I wanted to fill in all of the gaps in my own wrestling knowledge that, quite frankly, I felt ashamed for not knowing and like glossing over or looking past in my own writing, and I didn't want to make any further assumptions. So I just went back and step by step, figure by figure, I determined who were the essential Black pro wrestling figures from the eras that you mentioned and got it all down on paper. So really, I was just looking to write a book for myself to satisfy my own curiosity, and it's nice to hear that some other people have benefited from it as well.
When it comes to covering like an entire history of a culture and its contributions to pro wrestling, is it almost like just a completely different type of task than some of your individual projects that you have put together where you're working on one singular figure to go as deep as you can? Like, I just imagine this being from day one, it's a really daunting task. And at the end of it, trying to do justice to a lot of these different figures. What is that sort of process and how it differs?
Oh man, you're asking all the right questions. I mean, it starts with figuring out who matters. Honestly, it starts with figuring out the figures who mattered most, because some people, you get a smattering of wrestlers between 1900 and 19 or even 1890 and 1930, and even it's important to chronicle those folks as well, because you get a sense of how difficult it was for a Black wrestler to get into the business, um, and the difficulty in establishing or generating any sort of staying power. Like, that's also important to identify. But then you need to figure out who the guys are that, in a book that's 580 or so pages, the guys that you need to devote 10,000, 15,000 words or more to, or your book just simply hasn't done them justice, or a historian will rightly point out that it's a failing of your book. I could not put this book together and not include someone like Joe Godfrey, who was Tiger Flowers and the original Rufus Jones. I couldn't put this book together and not devote significant space to Clarence Bolden, who was of mixed race descent and wrestled as a Cuban wonder, when in reality he had a fully Black mother and was, I mean, he was, as far as I can decipher, the first world champion of any respectability who was of some semblance of Black descent in the U.S. You have to devote a lot of space to Seelie Samara. You have to give a lot of space to Jack Claybourne. You have to give Jim Mitchell his due, and you also have to make sure that you include the critical firsts of all of those guys and put them in their proper context. Like, for instance, one of my go-tos is Jack Claybourne in Hawaii. We look back on this and we say, oh, junior heavyweight championship, that's nothing. Well, most of the titles back then were junior heavyweight titles, because uh, most people back then weren't that large. It was hard to find a true heavyweight. So a lot of the top titles in these promotions were junior titles. And then you look at the title reign. Okay, it's in Hawaii and it's not quite a year. Well, that is the longest title reign by an identifiably black wrestler in history up until that point in the US. So you really need to call those things out. Otherwise, the significance of the achievements gets completely lost on people.
I had a question too, Ian, if you don't mind, that
Oh,
touches on
that's
process.
why I'm here. I'm
Of
here to
course.
answer whatever questions you have.
Awesome. And as John mentioned, the difference between co-writing a biography with a Hornswoggle or Steve Kieran or somebody like that, compared with a 600-page history, basically. And one thing I noticed in John and I were discussing what to review this month. We had a few options, and one of your other books was up there, and that was Gentleman Jack and Rufus, which was also released last year. So I wanted to ask you whether there was any overlap in creating both of these books, and at what point did you decide that Jack Claybourne and Rufus Jones deserve their own book as well?
Oh, great question, Neil. Thanks for that. I was working on them in parallel. And the reason I was working on them in parallel was because I could not have written a Jack Claybourne or Rufus Jones book without. And it's not like I can write a Jack Claybourne and Rufus Jones book and then not cover them at all in a comprehensive Black History book. You simply couldn't do that. But what a decided novelty is in a lot of ways intended to be, and this month typifies it on social media, and it drives me crazy. It's Black History Month, and I see endless tributes from all these sites to Bobo Brazil, an occasional tribute thrown into Bearcat Wright. And if I'm lucky, I'll see one for Luther Lindsay here or there. And one of the reasons I went to 1950, I mean, you have to cut it off somewhere, but is because 1950 is when Bobo Brazil gets his name. 1949 is when Bobo Brazil debuts. And by the time we reach that point, I've covered 20 Black wrestling figures of significance, including 5 or 6 prominent Black wrestlers who all came through Benton Harbor, Michigan, which is where Bobo Brazil grew up. So wrestlers who would have influenced him. I've covered the original Rufus Jones, for whom the term the cocoa butt was birthed. And this isn't to take anything away from Bobo Brazil. I'm from the Metro Detroit area in Michigan. I'm all for Bobo Brazil as a Michigan guy and a Detroit area legend. But his gimmick, his mannerisms, his significance, all of that stuff needs to be placed in its proper historical context. So I know this is a long-winded answer, and I'm going to land the plane. The point of all of this is that one of these days someone's going to write a Bobo Brazil biography. It's not going to be me. I don't have the interest or the stamina to do that at this point. But a decided novelty is written so that people looking to put the achievements of Black wrestlers in their proper context and placement going forward, they have a proper reference guide so that when they refer to Bobo Brazil, they can talk about what he got from Jim Mitchell, what he might have taken from Don Kindred, what he definitely got from the original Rufus Jones. And shoot, if you do a Rufus R. Jones biography, you know that you can't write that book without mentioning Joe Godfrey alongside him. So yes, the two books were written in tandem, but it was me proving the case that I could not have written Gentleman Jack and Rough Rufus had I not been writing a decided novelty alongside it, because I needed to do that research just to make sure I was paying the proper tribute and respect to Claybourne and Joe Godfrey without disrespecting something for which Jim Mitchell might have been the first, or Clarence Bolden might have been the first, or Seelie Samara might have been the first, if that makes sense.
I want to get your best assessment of why these figures have not been as focused upon. That, yes, we're talking about it, the turn of the century into the 20th century, but we are not disassociated from an Evan Strangler Lewis and right up through your Everett Marshalls and Gus Sonnenbergs. And clearly in a lot of your research here, like, there is contemporaneous coverage of all of these performers, but I would say, like, even like very ardent followers of pro wrestling, I think, would come away from a book like this just stunned at how little we were aware of these very, very seminal figures.
Yeah, if you want a reason, for that specifically, why someone like Sonnenberg would get praised and why Joe Godfrey wouldn't, and therefore, I mean, people went decades not realizing that Joe Godfrey was the original Tiger Flowers and was also the original Rufus Jones, and some people would still be surprised to learn that there even was an original Rufus Jones.
Yeah,
that predates the one they're familiar with. I honestly think a lot of it has to do with the way that we've collectively given short shrift to certain accomplishments, or our way of conceptualizing wrestling achievement has been modernized, and I'll unpack that a little bit.
sure.
We have a tendency, or I'm not going to blame any of you. I have a tendency, I know some others do, but I have a tendency to take historians' word for it, to take WWE's word for it when they tell me that something was important, and also something like the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, to take their word for it. And I get a vote for the Observer Hall of Fame. I usually don't want to tell people that, because then they want to know who I voted for, or then they blame me for things. And I want to attract as little of that smoke as I possibly can. But when it comes to determining who was important from the past, a lot of times we'll just say, okay, let's look at their title history. Well, they had this title here, this title here, this title here, and they held a world title here. Okay, they were a significant wrestler based on their title history. So there you go. I'm going to be voting for them. And for someone, I keep using Claybourne as an example, but Claybourne main evented everywhere he went from 1932 to about 1954. So he main evented almost everywhere he went across the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand for the better part of 22 years before his injuries, age, and sanctions caught up to him. And he started on his downward trajectory. But if Claybourne is given a championship in a third of the places that he wrestled, or in a third of the title feuds that he was involved in, he goes from being a guy who was he's improperly credited with being a British Empire champion in some places, but he goes from being a Hawaiian junior heavyweight champion and a Canadian open weight tag team champion alongside Luther Lindsay, which shouldn't be glossed over because it was the first North American race neutral tag title reign by black baby faces that I was able to find. But if you convert 1/3 of those feuds into a title reign of some kind, then he would have a dozen of them. And then we would look back and say, look at this black wrestler with all of these title reigns. He's obviously somebody we need to pay attention to, and he deserves induction into all of these halls of fame, etc. Instead, He's a guy who's easy to ignore. And we turn to the 1950s and 1960s when more allowances were being made, more so the 60s, when Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright start to win at least world tag titles in a lot of these territories that we're offering them. And suddenly everything pre-1950 is subject to getting ignored or dismissed as irrelevant because we go to the 1960s to get the guys who were really winning championships. And that's, again, not fair to the pioneers.
I wanted to also talk a bit about just, your extensive research and going back, and I don't care what era you are born in, it is stunning to see some of the coverage of these black performers of the time. That is just, racist doesn't quite do it justice when you're seeing headlines like, "Get out your lynching ropes, boys. Rufus Jones is coming to be in town." And sadly, this was very commonplace, and it's astounding when you see all of it just together in this book. And it was just like this dehumanizing language, and you do a great job of kind of breaking it down, even taking, like, just presenting them as illiterate, altering their statements to the press. And it's really just presenting these figures as like these non-human sideshow attractions that the press was just very complicit and fanning those flames to the public.
Yeah, and it was very much wrestling is always a product of the time that it's presented in, and promoters are always doing what they think will draw money in that era. And it's unfortunate that they felt they needed to resort to those tactics in particular to draw money. I love the story from Australia after Jack Claybourne and Seelie Samara have both come through there. I have to think about the year because I'm not sure if this made it into the book. It may have, but Jack Claybourne and Seelie Samara have both come through Australia, and they're not included on the following tour. And they were such fan favorites that the fans were asking, why aren't Seelie Samara and Jack Claybourne included on this tour? And the explanation that was provided to the public was, oh, well, the wrestlers on this tour are racists and didn't want, I'm summarizing, but the wrestlers are racist and didn't want to share the ring with their black contemporaries. And when you think about that, where you have both identifiable heels and baby faces on the roster, and you're essentially saying that the baby faces are racist too, and you're presenting it as if that's just okay or that's just acceptable. So that's one that caught me off guard. Nothing caught me off guard as much as it was one of the London newspapers when Frank Crozier was wrestling. This is, I think, 1906, when he was involved in the world title tournaments at the Alhambra. And they just use a hard R N-word as just an adjective. Jeez. Because he got tired of saying the Negro or the dark-skinned performer, so he just uses a hard R N-word, and that was just okay. So, yeah, that was, very interesting, but not atypical in those eras.
I think one of the things that struck me most about the book, Ian, is, first of all, how readable it is. You pick up perhaps a book that's this thick, and for our visual watchers, I think, this is going to be quite the undertaking. It's a very readable book. It's a great story, and it put me in mind of.
I'm relieved to hear that. By the way, I'm relieved to hear that.
And also just the amount of stuff that I did not previously know, and it put me in mind, if I can drop the name of another book that we reviewed in this past year of Queen of the Ring, about Mildred Burke and some of her contemporaries in the 1930s, 40s. And that introduced me personally. I'm not much of an historian beyond what was in my lifetime, unlike John. So figures like Jack Pfeffer and so on who pop up in that book as well. So I think this era before television is neglected by a lot of people who regard themselves as wrestling fans, who owe it to themselves to really educate themselves about some of this stuff. So I just wanted to throw in there that this is not, a back to school history book. It's a very entertaining book and a very educational one at the same time.
Well, thank you for that. I again, that's a relief to hear because I wanted it to be readable, and I wanted I wanted to give all of the narratives their proper space and their proper placement, so that you're learning about Dr. Billy Collins and the bullfighting and all of that, and how he transitions to wrestling. And then you're learning about Clarence Bolden, and we give Frank Crozier, the Scottish Jamaican world middleweight champion wrestler in England, we're giving him his proper space. And then we take a detour from that because we explain how Crozier's name is mentioned in the US, but he's never mentioned as a champion because they don't want to, seemingly they don't want to suggest that a black wrestler is capable of winning a world wrestling championship. And then we get into the Black Panther Illa Vincent, and I was pleased that I was able to allocate as much space as I could to George Godfrey, the boxer, and the juxtaposition between him and the original Reginald Seekie, because Reginald Seekie is given quite a bit of, in some cases he's given more respect than he's owed, and in others he isn't given nearly as much respect as he deserves. And what I mean is, people treat him like he was, some people treat him like he was this first dominant black wrestler. He lost far, far more often than he won. And in parallel to that, George Godfrey comes in as a very famous world championship caliber boxer, and he immediately comes in as this juggernaut and starts mowing people down and is outdrawing Jim Lundis. I mean, look, Jim Lundis is one of the all-time greatest draws in the history of wrestling, so we're not talking about the 100,000 plus figure that he drew in Greece, but when George Godfrey got started, he was outdrawing some of Lundis's recent appearances in the East Coast when he made his debut in Eastern wrestling rings. And it was nice to be able to get Godfrey in there and give him some credit, because it's due to him that a lot of wrestling promoters around the country realized, you know what, I can actually allow a black wrestler to win every so often and to appear dominant for a stretch, and it will not only will it not hurt us in the box office, but we might actually gain some fans here if we allow some black wrestlers to actually win. So again, thank you for the compliment of saying that it was readable and that a lot of information was presented, but I wanted to make sure I got every key and critical detail in there so that people had a well-rounded understanding of what was taking place before the television era.
I think you make the point quite clearly in the book that and it was something that was interesting to me, was the parallels between boxing and wrestling at that time in an era of deep kayfabe, where black boxers are or although the word, as you allude to, there's certainly it's not a completely clean sport. There is fixing going on, but black boxers are doing well, and perhaps part of the audience are wondering, well, why don't we have black pro wrestling champions as well? So that's a point well taken.
Yeah, that actually that was a point that came out in the Gentleman Jack Rough Rufus book. The only reason I'm bringing that up is there was an editorial when Rufus Jones makes his way into Utah, and one of the sports writers was, I mean, he's writing his editorial, but he's wondering aloud, why is it that we have no black champions in wrestling if this is actually supposed to be a legitimate sport? And we've had them all over the boxing world for decades at this point. So they're wondering aloud what it is that's keeping them from even getting within hailing distance of a world title in professional wrestling.
And who were some of the promoters that you found along the way that, retrospectively were advocates and did open some doors? Because
Charlie Gordon is the one that leaps off the page, because Joe Godfrey, in what, as far as I can tell, was his rookie year of wrestling as Ed Tiger Flowers before he goes to New York, he wins the world middleweight title, the top title in the region. He wins it in his very first year as a pro wrestler, and then goes off to win no world titles from then on once he becomes Rufus Jones, which is actually pretty humorous. But yeah, Charlie Gordon puts a world title on him immediately. And then when Charlie Gordon introduces Seelie Samara to, gets him out of Greenfield, where he was the Black Demon George Hodison, and introduces him to Boston as Seelie Samara, he brings him in as his first ever world heavyweight champion. So if we're talking about elevating black wrestlers to world title levels and at least attempting to frame them as equals to their white counterparts, then Charlie Gordon is the guy. But then you also have Sam Mushnick. Sam Mushnick, when he's starting to run opposition in St. Louis, one of the first ways that he goes about generating interest in his product is he brings in black wrestlers and starts a Negro title tournament that never reached he's attempting to have a legitimate one. It never reaches its conclusion, but he brings in King Kong Clayton, he brings in Seelie Samara, he brings in Rufus Jones, and he brings in Jack Claybourne. And it's a case where World War II interrupts the tournament, and then we don't really get a tangible result to it unless you want to argue that that's what the title match between Jack Claybourne and Seelie Samara a few years later in Los Angeles was. But yeah, Sam Mushnick is one of the guys who recognized the value that black wrestlers could hold, and that's clearly one of the reasons why it was one of his major promotional tactics when he first started running on his own in St. Louis.
I always understood the exceptional hardships, especially in Texas, where maybe you can add a little bit on this about something that was called the Texas Booking Bill. But I did not know the origin of this, of how it came out of the murder of this wrestler, William White Noble. And can you just tell us a little bit about Texas that went so far as to pass this bill where black and white wrestlers could not even have matches together?
I mean, it's honestly quite simple. The Texas, in a lot of these states, the boxing commissions and the wrestling commissions were run out of the same office. And if you wanted to prevent black boxers from fighting against white boxers for whatever reason, there was, if you wanted to make that argument, there was no reason why you would ban that, but then allow white wrestlers and black wrestlers to compete against one another. So when you pass that bill, it wipes out the competition in both sports. And that's why Jack Claybourne when he heads down there to wrestle as El Pantera Negra. He's banned from wrestling in El Paso, Texas, but he's allowed to wrestle as an Ethiopian hero in Mexico on the other side of the border. I mean, I'm sure that hurt him financially. I'll bet it cut his bookings at least in half. And the fact that they tried to get around it by arguing that he was Cuban was also pretty funny.
Yeah, and you see so many examples of that you outline in the book of a lot of these wrestlers that they would just assume a Cuban identity to get around these issues. And like by the end of this book, you could very much envision like a fantastic 30 for 30 or like just a documentary covering these. And I think really your four figures you really focus on are who you equate to like the four kings of boxing, and that being Claybourne, Rufus Jones, Jim Mitchell, and Seelie Samara. And there's quite an impact that World War II has as well, specific to those four. But what impact does the war have for a lot of these performers that are sort of in their primes at this period, and several of them are they end up going to fight overseas?
Well, in Jim Mitchell's case, the clearest fallout I'm able to find is he puts on a lot of weight. That's that was the result of I don't see where it really hurt him. If anything, he was forced to transition into a tactician and into a more physical wrestler as a result of that. The flying shoulder tackles were out of his arsenal at that point. It hurts Mushnick because it takes away some of the figures that were involved in his Negro title tournament. It exposes the fact that Rufus Jones had accumulated quite a bit of damage by that point, which is why he gets rejected from service, because everyone thought he was on his way to being shipped out of there. I don't recall why Claybourne didn't get shipped off to war, quite frankly. I don't think I was able to find that. But King Kong Clayton is another guy. He's in the middle of a multi-state Negro title feud with Seelie Samara, and suddenly he's gone for years. And when he comes back, he's many pounds heavier. He isn't nearly as agile, and his career, I mean, you can feel his you can feel the slowness as you're reading through it, that he just simply was not the guy that he was before he got shipped off. But at the same time, it seems to have accelerates the career of Don Blackman, because Don Blackman was just a guy, but he's stationed with and paired with Joe Louis, and he poses with Louis in the Jeep in this photo that gets quite a bit of national attention. Suddenly he's the most famous Black Panther in all of wrestling, and he's not even active in the ring. It's just by virtue of the fact that he was sitting next to Joe Louis when that photo was taken. And he becomes the trainer and discoverer of guys like Don Kindred, who also served, of guys like Frank James. He leverages his power such that he's able to have the first tours of the first use the terminology, the first all Negro wrestling tours of the Deep South, where he's taking Alex Kaffner and Frank James and some other guys along with him, with himself as the headliner. And Don Blackman is also the guy. He also takes Don Kindred and Frank James on separate tours of Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina, and ends up breaking that color line in the Mid-Atlantic region for Jim Crockett Sr., and becomes the first of the that became common for Crockett. Later on, you'd see it with guys like Willie Love and Bud Richardson, where he'd find two Black wrestlers and pair them up and then tour with them. And then he'd find a different pair of Black wrestlers and pair them up and tour the region with them. But Crockett starts that with Don Blackman and Don Kindred. And that and Don Blackman would never have been in a position to do that if it hadn't been for the popularity that he achieved during World War II.
I just had a last question to kind of start wrapping things up here.
Mm-hmm.
Finishing the book, Ian, though a lot of authors, they'll talk about like the first task is writing the book. The second task, and sometimes a more arduous one, is getting out there, promoting the book. Tell me just a bit about, releasing a book like this and then getting the word out. And can you put a value on a photo like this? Like, what does this mean when you open up X and you see this image? Because this is going to reach a lot of people. And I know that, putting out a release like this, it's quite the task of just promoting it, getting that word of mouth around.
Yeah, this is an invaluable photo. I really appreciate Big E for this. This is a case where I contacted his management team and asked, do you think this is something he'd be interested in? And they got right back to me and said, yes, he would love to read it. I sent it over to him, and I didn't even ask for the photo. And I just really wanted his feedback. Now, granted, I probably would have asked for the photo if he got back to me and said that he enjoyed it, but he received it, and the very next day he said that he was preparing to dive into it, and here's the photo of what I'm reading. And that was absolutely huge, because this may shock you, or maybe it won't. I'm a horrible self-promoter. I'm absolutely terrible when it comes to promoting my stuff. I'm exactly as famous as I want to be, which is not at all. When I get people wanting to debate me or argue with me about professional wrestling, like I'm just not interested. I love these unheralded and unresearched eras of pro wrestling, and I have a fondness for digging into that. I do not have a fondness for promoting myself in the slightest. So I appreciate Big E, because when wrestlers and people with notoriety like him, when they do things like that, it takes a lot of the hard work off my plate.
When it comes to, I too am a voter for the Observer Hall of Fame, and I would readily admit that it is very underrepresented when it comes to historical Black figures. And I read this book and I just feel like I wouldn't even be able to necessarily make a short list of like who would be like that you would want to advocate for. Do you look at, for the audience you are trying to reach, is like, what is the power of like an Observer Hall of Fame when it comes to shining a spotlight on these figures historically? Because there's ones that, yes, WWE does like its legacy wing, but I don't know if it's the audience is necessarily going to dive in that deep on its history as opposed to contemporary figures.
Yeah, I'm honestly, what I'd love to see happen, and if I ever speak with Meltzer again, I'll make the request and see what he says. What I would like to see happen, because you're familiar with the voting process, where they say, I follow the modern era, I follow the pioneer era, I follow Mexico, I follow Japan. I honestly think that the best way to get attention on some of these guys and get a few of them in the Hall of Fame is if you almost as if you treated it like you were handling the old Negro leagues of baseball, that you give them their own category, you list all of the names, and you force the voters to. I've heard guys like Jim Cornette and others say, back when Cornette actually submitted votes to the Observer Hall of Fame, that he would look at some of the names and he wasn't familiar with them, and then he had to go and do his own research and figure out what their value was and what their contributions were to pro wrestling. I think if you had a Black pioneer category, then you could list all of the names and people would be incentivized to read up on them and come to appreciate the value that those Black pioneers contributed to pro wrestling. So I think there's some merit to that. But aside from that, I don't know what you do. Fortunately, really quick story. Around the time my article on Clarence Bolden came out in The Ringer, I messaged the International Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame and said, look, you guys have done a really good job early on in inducting some of the pioneers from this era. I think you should take a close look at Clarence Bolden. And I was also reaching out because Clarence Bolden's family had read the Ringer article, reached out to me, and were very appreciative of it. And days later, the International Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame reached out and said, thank you for sending this. And on your recommendation, we're going to induct him into the Hall of Fame via the Trailblazer Award, and we're going to do that this year. Wow. So they invited the Bolden family up to New York and presented them with the plaque and the Hall of Fame ring. So more episodes like that would be appreciated. But I mean, you mentioned things like getting the word out with equates to sales. Honestly, seeing Clarence Bolden instantly inducted into the Hall of Fame as a result of work that I put in, there's nothing better than that, and there's no sales figure that's going to top that. So
that's pretty priceless.
I'll always cherish that.
Yeah. Speaking of the work that you put in, Ian, it must have been vast, and I did want to dig into that just a little bit before letting you go. The level of research to create a book of this length with the detail in there is obviously vast. How much of it were you able to readily find through online means, and how much did you have to do some sort of old-fashioned journalistic legwork for it and look at microfiche inside libraries and that kind of thing? For obviously, much of this is contemporaneous newspaper reporting that you're looking at.
Microfilm and microfiche, the bulk of which is available online nowadays, thankfully. Otherwise, this would have taken 20 or 30 years to put together. But even then, what's available online is so voluminous that I was carving out. I mean, I actually had a schedule like these 2 weeks. This is Jim Mitchell's time. These 2 weeks, this is Reginald Seekey's time, and trying to come up with at least. I mean, it wasn't a matter of coming up with at least 1,000 words a day. It was coming up with the right 1,000 words every day, because a lot of these guys, there's enough material available on them to devote an entire biography to each of them. And so when we're talking about guys like Seelie Samara and Jack Claybourne, it was about trimming it down to an appropriate length for a book like this when we're trying to cover as many pioneers as we possibly can.
Well, we definitely want to steer everyone, if you have not checked it out, really comes with a high recommendation, A Decided Novelty, The Essential Guide to Black Pro Wrestling History, 1880 to 1950. Ian is the author of many books, including a pair on Steve Kern, Brian Blair, Bugsy McGraw, Hornswoggle, Dan Severn, and his recent release, The History of Scottish Wrestling, Highland Games and Hippodromes. So,
oh man,
covering the entire gamut. So
yeah,
that is your latest release, and I believe it was with Brian Solomon you were talking about. Is this your swan song? Is this the final book, Ian? I hope not, but I understand you have put quite a lot out there for the historians.
Well, it can't be my swan song, and the reason it can't be is because I've already got a completed Mike Rotunda autobiography. That will be released at some point whenever he's feeling capable of doing some signings and doing the necessary stuff to support the release of the book. Whether or not there's really only one other subject that I think I would cover. So you might get book 12, but I'm not going to tell you what that would be because I'm paranoid. I'm worried about people taking my ideas. I'm an old Detroit Pistons fan. Isaiah Thomas is my guy, and he's famous for saying, "You're not going to give your game plan away on national television," and I'm not going to give my game plan away. But
Who says you're not a great self-promoter, Ian? That's a great hook right there.
I don't know about that. But yeah, you may see a 12th book out of me, but book number 11 will more than likely be Mike Rotunda's book. And at that point, I'm out. I've got to find other things to do with my life.
Well, Ian, I really enjoyed this book. Neil and I had a really enjoyable time kind of just going through this, and to have you on was a great pleasure. I want to wish you all the best of success with the new book, any further releases, and wrestling's always hard to you never say never. So we will see what else is in the Ian Douglas canon out there. But thank you so much for joining us. You stuck around long after our agreed upon time, so we thank you.
Well, thanks for not roasting the book. I was when you invited me on the show at first, you didn't say whether you enjoyed it or not. So I thought I was going to be subject to a firing squad. So
I think you'd be very hard pressed to come out of this book and not be really impressed with just how much you would learn from it. Like quite frankly, I came away from this book and I felt embarrassed that I did not know about so many of these figures, and I would imagine many people would come away just learning so much about history of an industry that it's been undercovered, and these are figures that had a great impact, and it took someone like you to really put this on the record and out there in an accessible form.
Well, if you ever want to feel important, then I would not that you don't feel important, John, but if you ever really wanted to feel important, I would suggest attempting to write a book like this, because when you realize that you might be the only one that dares to tackle a subject matter that's this weighty to you and that you consider to be this important, I'm driving around town. I'm 400 pages into the writing of the book, and I'm driving around Durham, North Carolina, saying, man, I got to be careful, because if something happens to me, this is never going to get released, and then no one will know. So yeah, I learned that I have to take good care of myself if I want to get the information out to people.
Well, we're glad you finished. You passed the finish line for the book. So,
Yeah.
all the best, Ian, and maybe down the road we can chat about some Scottish wrestling history with you at some point.
I would love to, John and Neil. Both of you, thanks for having me.
All right, that's going to wrap it up for us. You can always catch a book club each month here on the Post Wrestling Cafe.